The Origin and Future of the Ketogenic Diet by Dr. Dominic D'Agostino and Travis Christofferson. Read by Johnny Rockermeier. Chapter 1. Jim Abrahams and his newborn son Charlie. The year is 1992. In the front yard, on an innocent spring morning in 1993, Hollywood movie producer Jim Abrahams rhythmically pushed his son Charlie in a swing. Behind him were the busy noises of his wife Nancy and Charlie's two siblings as they prepared the house for a celebration. It was Charlie's first birthday. Nobody was prepared for what came next. It happened in a moment. Suddenly, Charlie's head slumped to the side, and then out of nowhere his arm shot into the air, as if possessed by some unseen force. Deep down, Abrahams knew that something was seriously wrong. A moment before his son was healthy, and now, a fleeting instant later, he was not. A series of neurological tests proved his instincts were correct. "Your son has epilepsy," the neurologist told him. He then went on to explain that epilepsy, although a single diagnosis, really consists of a wide spectrum of illness, from mild to severe. And within the spectrum, the seizures that define the disease are as diverse as a box of crayons. Partial, generalized, and absent seizures comprise the three main groupings. These are then further parsed into tonic, tonic-clonic, myoclonic, and atonic seizures. Each category describes a choreographed path of involuntary muscle contractions that spin outward from the neurological chaos unraveling within the brain. As some time passed, tragically Charlie's case landed more toward the severe end of the spectrum. And it wasn't just the nature of the seizures, it was the frequency. He was having up to 100 seizures a day. It was heartbreaking to watch. Time after time, the toddler's brain was taken over while he tried to play. In the middle of stacking a block or blowing a horn, he would pause and then slump over, sometimes remaining still, and others with a limb or two shaking uncontrollably. And then it was over and life would more or less resume where it left off. It was life lived in intervals. A day was not the seamless continuum most of us take for granted. It was a chopped up into tiny little slices. It was a fate worse than death, said Abrahams. The house was filled with tears. All of us, all the time, cried. Charlie was put on one medication after another, a process that seemed haphazard and experimental. The odds were already stacked against them. If an epileptic child fails the first drug, the chance the next drug will work drops to 10 to 15%. Nevertheless, the doses were upped, and the drugs were given in combination. New with old, old with new, but nothing seemed to blunt the attacks. Worse, the Abrahamses watched helplessly as the drugs changed their child in the few good moments he was spared. You pour the drugs down your child's throat despite the fact there is something inside you that says, "Wait a minute, this can't be right," said Abrahams. My son was so loaded at times he just lived in his car seat. He was essentially non-functional. The Abrahamses were delicately told by the doctors that Charlie's illness came with additional consequences. The severity and frequency, at this age, would affect the development of his brain. If left unchecked, it would lead to progressive retardation. So it was a race against time. Desperate, the Abrahamses did everything they could. The physician they went to at UCLA, Dr. Donald Shields, was a nationally recognized expert in children's epilepsy. They didn't stop there. They sought a second, third, fourth, and fifth opinion. But nothing new was offered. Each doctor's opinion was just a reiteration of the last. Stick with the drugs. But the drugs simply weren't working. The doctors didn't seem to share the Abrahamses' sense of urgency. Every day was important. Charlie was slowly falling into an abyss. The doctors finally capitulated, and they turned to the option held in reserve: surgery. But the glimmer of hope surgery held vanished once Charlie recovered and the relentless assault of seizures continued. With nowhere left to turn, at the end of the road, the Abrahamses turned to a faith healer. Still, Nothing. For the Abrahamses, if any sort of resignation creeped in, it only served to stoke a fire. There is no greater instinctual surge than of protective parents. After thousands of epileptic seizures, an incredible number of drugs, dozens of blood draws, 8 hospitalizations, a mountain of EEGs, MRIs, CT scans and PET scans, 1 fruitless brain surgery, 5 pediatric neurologists in 3 cities, 2 homeopaths, 1 faith healer, and countless prayers, the seizures continued unchecked. But giving up was never an option. And so Jim Abrahams began his own research. He began combing through books and attending medical lectures. It was an education rolled up in a frantic mission. Then one day, on the bottom shelf at the medical library, he picked up a book published that year by Dr. John Freeman, titled Seizures and Epilepsy in Childhood, A Guide for Parents. The book was written for parents to help them cope. But buried deep inside were 3 pages on a dietary protocol used to treat epilepsy. Dr. Freeman had tried to write a book focused solely on the diet but was unable to find a publisher, so he snuck them into this book, almost as an afterthought. Within the few pages was the remarkable claim that the diet was able to help at least half of those who maintained it. The first impulse that ran through Abraham's mind was bewilderment. If it had any legitimacy, why hadn't one of the 5 doctors mentioned this treatment option by now? I couldn't make the leap between all these doctors saying one thing, and this other guy saying something else, he later confessed. Confused and desperate, he had what he felt were only 2 options left: the strange diet, and an herbalist someone had told him about, working out of a strip mall in Houston, Texas. At the next appointment, when he asked Dr. Shields which one he should pursue, Shields said, "Flip a coin. Neither will probably work." And so he did just that. He and his wife Nancy literally flipped a coin. Heads the herbalist, tails the strange diet. It landed on heads. So, the family traveled to Houston and met the herbalist. They took his advice, bought a grocery bag full of herbs, and returned home. After a few weeks of mixing herbal teas, it became apparent that the strange-smelling concoctions were having no effect on Charlie's seizures. This was the end of the line. The best doctors in the world, the best drugs in the world, surgery, homeopaths, faith healers, herbalists, everything had failed Charlie. Charlie and his family were backed into a corner. There was only one option left. So, with only a thread of hope, desperate, deflated, and exhausted, the Abrahamses boarded a plane to Baltimore, Maryland, to see John Freeman about the peculiar and obscure treatment called the ketogenic diet. Oddly enough, as they flew to the East Coast, at some point in the upper Midwest, perhaps over the Ohio Valley, if the Abrahamses could have peered 80 years into the past, they would have looked down and seen a train heading in the opposite direction to Battle Creek, Michigan. On board were their exact counterparts, a desperate family with their epileptic son, at the end of their rope, traveling to the only option left to them: a long shot. Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And the stories of these families rhymed in every sentence and verse. But in a larger context, each story, astonishing in its own right, serves only as bookmarks. It is what happened in the interim, the 80 years that lie in between, which reveals volumes. Critically, it is a vitally important lesson of the infallibility and undulating path of medical science, and a stark reminder that valuable knowledge, even in the modern era, can be lost. The story of both families converge on a single man, Bernard McFadden. Although almost entirely forgotten today, in the early 1900s almost everyone knew his name. McFadden was a bona fide American icon. His rise to fame was also uniquely American. He started with nothing. In fact, less than nothing. He was cast into the world with the odds decidedly stacked against him. His early years were filled with pain and abandonment. His father beat him and his family, before drinking himself to death when McFadden was 5 years old. When Bernard McFadden was 7, His mother sent him away to the cheapest boarding school she could find because she was dying from late-stage tuberculosis and was unable to care for him any longer. McFadden then escaped, what he called the starvation school, and fell into a series of indentured servitudes for distant relatives and farmers, working 100-hour weeks and paid only in room and board. But like all American icons, McFadden fought back, scratching and clawing for a better place in the world. When he was 15, he accidentally wandered into a newly established gymnasium in St. Louis. One look past the threshold was all it took. Inside, men were grunting and sweating while they hoisting dumbbells and performed calisthenics. Posters of musclemen plastered the walls. As he stared open-mouthed and wide-eyed, McFadden was at the same time enthralled and infected. Right there, he swore an oath. I'm going to look like them. I'm going to be like them. Over time, Bernard McFadden parlayed his sworn oath into an empire. Recognizing an opportunity, he started a magazine called Physical Culture. What started as a modest enterprise soon rocketed skyward with dazzling growth. It was a fresh, new message for Americans. Within the pages, he proselytized health, vitality, and uninhibited enjoyment of the human body. He advocated exercise, healthy eating, and avoidance of tobacco, too much alcohol, and white bread, a substance McFadden called the staff of death. He encouraged nude sunbathing, walking barefoot, and warned of the evils of prudishness. The body, claimed McFadden, was for unrestrained enjoyment. For the first time, Americans were told sex was good and was nothing to be ashamed of. His magazines were provocative, the first to use scantily clad models, engaging, and told Americans there was a new and better way to live. He had tapped into a new niche. He had become America's first health guru, forging a new culture and selling a lifestyle. He was the driving force behind the rise of bodybuilding. He handpicked an unknown Brooklyn model named Charles Atlas and gave him the title, World's Most Perfect Man, and then was the architect behind a career path that led to Atlas's fame and fortune. Americans' appetite for McFadden's new lifestyle was insatiable. Halfway through the year 1900, McFadden was selling 110,000 copies of his magazine Physical Culture per month. His rapid success came with a new cockiness. The wildly popular magazine, claimed McFadden, not only blazed the path to health and vitality, now it was revealing his secrets to curing disease. Any disease. His belief was sincere and consisted of a prescriptive lifestyle that he claimed would bring anyone back from the throes of illness. The prescription consisted of the principles he had been proselytizing for most of his life: exercise, sunlight, avoidance of alcohol, tobacco, and diet. But the most important piece, the one imperative ingredient to pull people from the ghostly realm of the sick back into vitality, was something McFadden felt held almost magical healing properties: fasting. McFadden's belief in fasting, while maybe largely forgotten, certainly wasn't new. Its restorative powers go far back into antiquity. The Greek physician Hippocrates made reference to the healing properties of fasting. He said, "Everyone has a doctor in him. We just have to help him in his work." The natural healing force within each one of us is the greatest force in getting well. To eat when you are sick is to feed your sickness. Incredibly, the virtues of fasting, or overconsumption in general, went even further back, all the way to 3800 BC. An inscription found in an Egyptian pyramid read, "Humans live on 1/4 of what they eat. On the other 3/4 lives their doctor." A glib quote that could easily describe the relationship between food and medicine today. Other famous people have touted fasting throughout history, including Ben Franklin. The best of all medicines is resting and fasting. Mark Twain wrote, "A little starvation can really do more for the average sick man than can the best medicines and the best doctors." McFadden embraced the time-honored practice that had strangely bounced in and out of favor through thousands of years of history. Perhaps the counterintuitive nature of sick people not eating served to pull it back into obscurity time and time again. Rarely would a grandmother, parent, or a physician in their right mind suggest that a sick person should stop eating. It goes against every fiber of instinct. However, Bernard McFadden stumbled onto the salubrious practice of fasting. His faith in its powers were reinforced by personal observation and trial. While working on a farm, he had noticed that whenever an animal became ill, it stopped eating. Years later, one spring he felt the early symptoms of pneumonia stirring in his chest. He remembered the lesson of the farm animals and cut back to a couple pieces of fruit per day. He noticed by the second day his chest had begun to clear, and by the fourth day the symptoms had all but vanished. McFadden's sideways entry into medicine ultimately culminated in the creation of a sanatorium in 1907. A massive mansion equipped with swimming pools, gyms, Russian and Turkish baths, and relaxation areas. The Berner McFadden Sanatorium. He had changed his name from Bernard to Berner because it sounded like the roar of a lion. Was located in Battle Creek, Michigan, a small town turned overnight into a beacon for the sick. Directly across the street stood the famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, started by John Harvey Kellogg, whose brother capitalized on the health trend and started the Kellogg Cereal Company. 300,000 health seekers visited the Battle Creek Sanitarium during its 65 years of operation. Every day, the train dropped off a fresh crop, complaining of a variety of ailments, a portion of which now headed to McFadden's new sanatorium with the hope of getting well. Most of those that showed up on McFadden's doorstep had vague symptoms like headaches, weight loss, digestive problems. It was really no surprise, as the typical diet of a century ago consisted mostly of salted pork, bread, and potatoes. The first vitamin would not be discovered until 1912, and Americans were entirely unaware how deficient their diets truly were. Also, the workforce had begun the transition to desk jobs. The combination of a terrible diet and inactivity left many Americans in a sorry state, so they turned to McFadden to help. At the sanatorium, McFadden hired an osteopath doctor named Hugh Conklin as an assistant. He prescribed to the same belief system as McFadden. They both believed that medicine, the way it was practiced, was largely fraudulent. Together, they called out the medical establishment. "We will take those you have given up on and cure them." This was fine for the mostly vague and undiagnosable masses that showed up. After a period of stress-free fasting, hydrotherapy, and light exercise in and around the beautiful mansion, they did feel better. Of course, some of the more conservative doctors pushed back, claiming McFadden and his hand-picked doctors were the worst kind of quacks, the kind that preyed on those that were healthy but thought they were sick. But McFadden had star power on his side. One of his more famous clients, Upton Sinclair, defended him vigorously, even publishing a book titled The Fasting Cure, dedicated to his good friend B.M. Occasionally, patients with very tangible illnesses, like epilepsy, showed up on McFadden's doorstep. For the detractors of McFadden, this, they thought, would surely be where he would fail. Epileptic patients, in particular, came with a built-in yardstick. The therapies prescribed would face a true test because of one simple fact: the number of seizures could be counted before and after treatment, thus determining if the treatment was effective or not. It's not clear if Conklin or McFadden knew the history of epilepsy. If they did, they would have known there was a scattering of evidence backing the idea that fasting would actually work for epilepsy. In the 5th century BC, Hippocrates reported on a man who had been seized by convulsions. A fast was prescribed and the cure worked, freeing the individual of seizures. In a quotation from the King James Version of the Bible, Mark tells the story of Jesus curing an epileptic boy where his disciples had failed. When they asked him why, Jesus said, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." And so Conklin began to count. He recorded the number of seizures before and after treatment. When the numbers were tallied, the result was shocking and undeniable. Fasting did work for epileptic patients. Once they stopped eating, an invisible metabolic levee was raised around the brain. The neurological storms that once pounded the shores were abruptly dispelled. For some reason, however, Conklin felt no immediate compulsion to publish his data. But it didn't matter. Nature abhors a vacuum. The medical establishment had no good solutions, and so word of the drugless healer in Battle Creek, Michigan, claiming to have an effective treatment for epilepsy, gradually began filtering into the public at large. As rumors of Conklin's water diet rippled outward from the center of the country, doctors continued to treat epilepsy with the few drugs they had. The most commonly prescribed drug was potassium bromide. In the mid-1800s, it was thought epilepsy was caused by excessive sexual indulgence, particularly masturbation. In 1857, British Dr. Charles Lockhart read a report claiming people had become temporarily impotent after taking potassium bromide. By his own reckoning, Lockhart made the connection. Maybe the drug would assuage the sexual gluttony of epileptics and, as a result, stop their seizures? The drug worked in spite of Lockhart's faulty logic. A decade later, doctors began questioning the link between excessive sexuality and epilepsy. More likely, they reasoned, bromide was acting directly on the brain rather than through the indirect suppression of sexual desire. Bromide is a powerful sedative, and researchers made the irresistible connection between the nervous eruption of a seizure and the drug's ability to slow nervous impulses, like pouring water on a fire. In 1872, one researcher wrote, "The object of medical treatment for epilepsy is to control the over-readiness of nervous action. For this purpose, sedatives have been employed with success." The connection was powerfully seductive and would guide the search for new anti-seizure medications for the foreseeable future. The search for new epilepsy drugs was now synonymous to finding drugs that were sedative. The two qualities were thought to be inseparable. The next breakthrough happened on a fall day in 1912. It happened because a young medical student named Alfred Hauptmann was sleep deprived. The young German, resident psychiatrist, lived over the epileptic ward while he was in medical training. Below him, seizures tormented his patients throughout the night. He could hear them thrash and convulse, sometimes even the thud of one of them falling out of bed. The unremitting sounds forbade sleep. As he tossed and turned, he realized he had to try something. A new sleeping pill called Luminal had just hit the pharmacy a year earlier. During his medical training, he learned potassium bromide worked as an anti-seizure medication precisely because it was a sedative. It wasn't unreasonable to think that Luminal might work through the same mechanism. In the very least, he thought, maybe both he and his patients could get a good night's sleep. And so the next evening, right before bedtime, he gave each of his patients a dose of the new drug. To his delight, Hauptmann slept soundly that night, as did his patients. He would have left it at that, a simple remedy for a good night's sleep, but he noticed something remarkable. His patients' reprieve from seizures extended into the next day. They didn't have any. Hauptmann made the connection hovering before him. Perhaps this drug, chemically known as phenobarbital, could be a new medication for epilepsy. Once he published his observation, phenobarbital began to be prescribed and slowly built momentum, eventually overtaking potassium bromide's position as the first-line treatment for epilepsy. Although better at preventing seizures than potassium bromide, for patients, Luminal was still a compromise. Fewer seizures was swapped for a life lived in a fog, a hazy, blunted state of existence. Doctors assumed it was a zero-sum game. Fewer seizures came at the expense of sedation. It was accepted this was just the way it had to be. Chapter 2. Charles Howland's Question. In 1921, H. Raul Guylan, a prominent endocrinologist at New York Presbyterian Hospital, took the podium at the annual American Medical Association convention. Rather than the typical, dry run through mountains of graphs and charts, Guylan chose to tell a story. He spoke of a young cousin who had epilepsy. Over 4 years he watched as his cousin tried every treatment recommended by several neurologists, including the boy's uncle who was a professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins. The family watched helpless as every treatment failed, including bromides and the newer drug phenobarbital, Luminal. The desperate family took what they saw as the only option left, a train ride to Battle Creek, Michigan to see McFadden and Conklin. By now, Conklin had treated an untold number of patients, probably numbering in the hundreds. Guylan explained how the young cousin fasted under the supervision of Conklin for 3 or 4 weeks. Remarkably, the seizures stopped after the second day, and the remission proved remarkably durable. His cousin remained seizure-free for over 2 years after completion of the treatment. For Guylan, it was impossible to ignore the result. First, because of the intimate family connection, and second, because he knew his cousin had failed every other treatment, the best those in the audience, the doctors sitting before him, had to offer. So Guylan looked closer. He carefully followed 2 other patients that traveled to Battle Creek to see Dr. Conklin. The patients, Guylan confirmed, at least for the time being, were cured. They remained free of seizures after returning home. Then, Robb Guylan took the next logical step. He saw if he could replicate Conklin's results by fasting his own patients. Now, in front of the hushed audience, he presented the results. After fasting 30 patients for 20 days in his clinic, 87% of the patients became seizure-free. The results evoked gasps from the audience. The rumors of the drugless Midwestern healer that publicly announced his disdain for conventional medicine were now staring them in the face. It was no longer a rumor. Guylan had cast it into documented fact. For the doctors in the auditorium, the treatment of epilepsy remained as frustrating of an enterprise as it always had. Surely patients with no other disease have grasped at so many therapeutic straws, wrote one doctor. Epilepsy comes from ancient Greece, meaning to seize, possess, or afflict. The Greeks also called epilepsy the sacred disease, and as civilizations before them, they thought it was a form of spiritual possession. Consequently, for centuries victims were treated with one pointless ritual after the next. In the 5th century BC, Hippocrates boldly challenged the assumption epilepsy was divine in origin, declaring it was a medically treatable problem emanating from the brain. Hippocrates' declaration would change the course of the disease forever, thrusting it into the empirical arena of real medicine. But the transition would not be smooth. His declaration started what would be a series of clumsy, barbaric, and sometimes bizarre attempts to treat the disease. The eccentric and unrelated treatments were a reflection of the fact epilepsy was of mysterious and unknown origin. Doctors' attempts to mute epileptic fits were patchwork of trial and error: bloodletting, trephining of the skull, which is boring a hole in the skull to release the disease, removal of the ovaries and adrenal glands, countless drugs, herbs, and tinctures. When the Roman physician Celsus witnessed epileptics drinking blood from the wounds of dying gladiators, he wrote, "What a miserable disease that makes tolerable such a miserable remedy." And in 1921, as Guylan gave his presentation, little had changed. "Many modern cures are not less miserable," wrote a respected neurologist, comparing the state of treatment in the 1920s to those of the past. Doctors still had little to offer the victims of epilepsy, and that a non-conventional osteopath had discovered what might be the best treatment available was met with a degree of skepticism, frustration, and embarrassment. The father of Guylan's young cousin, Charles Howland, was a wealthy New York corporate attorney. Shocked that the cure to his son's epilepsy lies so far outside the medical establishment, Howland became obsessed with a single question: why did fasting cure his son of epilepsy? Conklin already thought he knew the answer. He claimed epilepsy emanated from the intestines. He speculated that toxins were secreted from the lymph nodes surrounding the small intestine, then stored in the lymph system, and from time to time, discharged into the bloodstream, causing seizures. Simply not eating allowed the toxins to be cleared. Conklin had no evidence to back his claim. His reasoning was nothing more than a wild guess, probably pushed along by McFadden. Along with many doctors, Charles Howland wasn't satisfied with Conklin's contrived explanation. Instinctually, Howland felt there was more to it. He desperately wanted to know. He wanted an answer backed by actual evidence. In hope of finding an answer, he wrote a check to his brother, a professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins, for $5,000. $5,000 went a long way in the early 1900s, and Dr. Howland used the money to set up a state-of-the-art laboratory at Johns Hopkins dedicated to the new mission. As with his brother, the question quickly became a particular obsession. The answer, reasoned Howland, was sure to lie within some shift in the epileptic's metabolism. To find the answer would be an exercise in comparison. What did the metabolism of the epileptic look like before and after fasting, and could the relevant factor be isolated from the noise? Far too steep a task for any individual, he turned to Dr. James Gamble, an unusually precise and methodical clinical chemist. The canvas for Gamble's search consisted of 4 fasting epileptic children. He carefully monitored every known biochemical variable as they transitioned into the fasting state. He collected and exhaustively analyzed their urine and blood with painstaking detail, from water loss to electrolytes balance, acid-base balance, and the curious mention of the strange occurrence of 2 ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, in the fasting patient's plasma and urine. To Gamble, the compounds were a mystery. He speculated that they were meaningless, the byproduct of the incomplete oxidation of fats, nothing more than a useless exhaust expelled as the patients began to burn fat. In the end, despite an extensive search, the report held no definitive answer. The biochemical shift that reduced seizures in fasting epileptics, for the time being, remained a mystery. As Howland's team continued its frenzied search, about 1,000 miles west, in Chicago, the seeds were being planted to offer up a different explanation. Chapter 3. Food Becomes Medicine. Roland Woodyat and Everts Graham, both medical doctors in Chicago, were having an argument over lunch. The waiter was already tense. Their voices were elevated, and, worse, they had scribbled arcane symbols all over the tablecloth. It was most likely ruined. The argument had drifted away from the scribblings into something more personal. "Your perfectionism is holding you back, can't you see that?" said Graham, clearly frustrated. "Did you know it took Lorenzo Ghiberti 20 years just to sculpt the bronze doors of the Baptistry of San Giovanni?" "Perfection doesn't care how long something takes," retorted Woodyat, in a measured voice. Woodyat was a perfectionist, in every sense of the word, and Graham was not the first to notice. He could agonize over the wording of a single sentence, sometimes for an entire day. Graham found this absurd, a waste of time and talent. But for the study of human metabolism, Woodyat's peculiar personality trait was perhaps his greatest strength. He was intensely passionate about the details. He could zero in, focus with singular purpose, and not allow himself to be railroaded by the incredibly complex maze of metabolic pathways where others quickly became overwhelmed. In the summer of 1921, Woodyat's passion for metabolism culminated in an article titled, "Objects and Method of Diet Adjustment in Diabetes." Although insulin had yet to be isolated, researchers knew that the pancreas was the site of pathology. Injecting diabetic dogs with pancreatic extract could normalize blood sugar levels. Woodyat realized that the problem in the diabetic lies solely in pancreatic dysfunction, resulting in an inability to utilize excessive carbohydrate. At the time, physicians often fasted diabetics until glucose disappeared from the urine, the idea being to rest the pancreas. A normal diet was then slowly reintroduced, usually with carbohydrates first. Unfortunately, the diabetics soon found themselves back where they started, with sugar building up to malevolent levels within the bloodstream. That fasting cleared the bloodstream of sugar made Woodyat curious, inspiring him to ask a simple question. If fasting diabetic patients resort to burning their own fat, why not just provide fat through diet, keep the carbohydrates away, and keep the diabetic in the fasted state indefinitely? It was a simple proposal of exclusion. It was a question that perhaps should have been asked sooner, but at the time it was easy for researchers to get lost in the details. Big questions still lingered. The largest was the fate of dietary fat. It was not clear if fat could be converted directly into sugar. But Woodyat refused to let the gaps in knowledge lead to a dead end. When a pathway was unknown, he let empirical macro evidence guide him. In this case, he knew another group had already experimented with a high-fat, low-carb diet in diabetics with striking success. Even if fat was able to be converted into glucose, it really didn't matter, reasoned Woodyat. Something appeared to be blocking its conversion. He was formulating a hypothesis that had only lingered in and out of researchers' minds, but had never been concretely suggested. Once he wrote it down, it seemed obvious. Why not shift the ratio of the diet in favor of fat? This way the diabetic would be able to rest his pancreas, remove the excess sugar from his bloodstream, and utilize fat instead as an energy source. The smoldering problems of insulin, carbohydrates, and blood sugar were removed from the equation. He couldn't help chastising the medical community for their inflexible, dogmatic assumptions, isolating the problem as a tendency toward dietary groupthink. The universal custom of thinking of the food supply simply as so much carbohydrate, so much protein, so much fat, and so many calories without further analysis, wrote Woodyat. The patient doesn't even have to be deprived, he reasoned. They could consume the same amount of total calories. In a single sentence, Woodyat toppled the monolithic view of diet. Now, because of him, diet was no longer viewed as a concrete pillar. Now it was a column built from subcategories, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, that could be manipulated, shifted, and restacked in different combinations depending on the needs of the patient. While Woodyat was exposing fissures in dietary preconceptions, in the summer of 1921, 350 miles northeast of Chicago at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, a doctor named Russell Wilder published 3 short paragraphs in the Clinical Bulletin. The letter described the same dietary epiphany as Woodyat, maintaining the fasting state by replacing carbohydrates with fat. But Wilder imagined treating a different disease, epilepsy. It has occurred to us that the benefit of Dr. Guyland's procedure may be dependent on the ketonemia which must result from such fasts, and that possibly equally good results could be obtained if a ketonemia were produced by some other means, wrote Wilder. But Wilder had made an additional leap of logic. Woodyat had suggested the dietary protocol simply as a means to sidestep the impaired carbohydrate metabolism of diabetics. How fasting, or the dietary maintenance of fasting, worked to control seizures demanded another explanation. Wilder reasoned perhaps there was more to it, suggesting the ketones generated from the diet might be of unrecognized significance. After all, they were the single metabolic variable shared between the fasting state and a low-carb, high-fat diet. Until now, researchers assumed ketones were nothing but unhealthy metabolic debris. But now, because of Wilder, that assumption was questioned. Perhaps it was ketones themselves that were pulling the metabolic levers inside the brain of fasting epileptics. Wilder was anxious to test his theory. It is proposed, therefore, to try the effect of such ketogenic diets on a series of epileptics. It's hard to quantify the influence that words have. Attaching a name to an idea converts it from an abstraction into something tangible and concrete. Wilder's naming of the ketogenic diet was to thrust it into the clinic. Now it was real. Now it was something that could be measured, tested, and prescribed. Under the lamp of Woodyat and Wilder's clarifying epiphanies, Dr. Miney Peterman, a Mayo Clinic pediatrician, enthusiastically put Wilder's theoretical diet to a clinical test. First, he strictly defined the ketogenic diet to be tested, parceling it into 1 gram of protein per kilogram of the child's body weight, 10 to 15 grams of carbohydrates per day, and the remainder of the calories in fat. Next, he began recruiting epileptic patients and convincing them to try the strange protocol. The scientific community was watching closely. They eagerly waited for the results. Once released, Peterman's report revealed that the diet's effect was incredible. Most of the children, once racked with convulsions, experienced an immediate and powerful remission. They began to live normal lives. The price was minimal. Occasionally, a child became nauseated and vomited, and so Peterman found a little orange juice was an instant fix. but most transitioned to the new diet well and had few complaints. The ketogenic diet, at first only a fragile theory, was indeed working. While running his clinical trials, Peterman noticed something else. Not only were the vast majority of kids either experiencing greatly diminished numbers of seizures, or were free of them altogether, but there seemed to be a striking change in their character. Peterman noticed that children were sleeping better, were less irritable, and displayed an increased interest and alertness. This was in sharp contrast to the pharmacological treatments that dulled and muted the children, as if a wet blanket was pulled over their brains. The ketogenic diet, Peterman observed, lifted the fog. Peterman followed 37 children on the diet for 4 months up to 2.5 years. All tallied, 60% of the children became seizure-free, 34.5% were improved, and 5.5% were not improved. The ketogenic diet was a resounding success, undeniably better than phenobarbital and bromides. While the newly debuted ketogenic diet was being studied at the Mayo Clinic, doctors on the East Coast were still deeply immersed in neurochemical transformation induced by fasting. Therapeutically, fasting had obvious limitations. The biggest problem, doctors realized, is that fasting was clearly only a temporary solution. The seizures were greatly diminished, if not stopped altogether while the child was not eating, but of course, it could not be maintained. In some of the more mild cases, after the fast, the seizures never returned. But in many cases, once the child resumed eating, the seizures gradually resumed. Wilder's ketogenic diet offered an immediate solution to this problem. The therapeutic effect of fasting could now be extended on a patient-by-patient basis. News from the Mayo Clinic trial quickly spread. Massachusetts General Hospital, in 1924, pivoted away from fasting and adopted the ketogenic diet as a treatment for epilepsy. Others were soon to follow. New studies tallied similar results as the original done by Peterman, and others also noticed the positive effects the diet seemed to have on the children. One researcher commented, "The diet is well tolerated without causing any untoward symptoms in the patients. On the contrary, they seem to be more alert and less nervous." After tinkering with the ratios, clinicians determined that a formula of 4 parts fat to 1 part protein to carbohydrate seemed to work best, a ratio that has stood the test of time and today is known as the classic ketogenic diet. Instructions for the ketogenic diet, meal plans, and extensive tables listing the nutritional composition of foods were added to textbooks. In response to rising demand, the Mayo Clinic published a pamphlet describing detailed meal plans and recipes for the ketogenic diet. Soon, clinicians and dietitians at hospitals across the country were prescribing the new dietary treatment for epilepsy. Untold numbers of families with epileptic children were restocking their pantries and adjusting their family dinners. For doctors and the families of the afflicted, it was probably an easy choice, as the only 2 drugs on the market were highly sedative, and the diet was the opposite. It required some work, it wasn't an easy fix, but the benefit was striking, immediate, and enduring for most. Word swiftly spread and the ketogenic diet became the preferred therapy for epilepsy across the country. The results of fasting and the ketogenic diet are apparently the best that are obtained by any therapeutic procedure that we have to offer the epileptics in childhood today, Robb told the American College of Physicians at a gathering in New Orleans in 1928. Chapter 4. Like Stones for a Mosaic. Charles Howland refused to give up. In 1922, undeterred by his brother and Gamble's failure to find a definitive answer, he set out to expand the list of experts to help answer his question. He singled out Dr. Stanley Cobb, the associate professor of neuropathology at Harvard Medical School. Cobb was a cautious and careful scientist from a prominent Boston family that was speculated to have entered the neurosciences as a result of a childhood stammer. Cobb was already familiar with Howland's story. He was in the audience a year earlier when Guyland presented the case of his young cousin's trek to Battle Creek and the successful treatment by Conklin. To Cobb, the story was not entirely surprising. Rumors of Conklin's early results had intrigued him, and he had begun to investigate fasting's effect within his own lab. When Guylan had finished his presentation, Cobb excitedly shared his own work with the attendees, commenting that he had witnessed the therapeutic effect firsthand, preventing convulsions in animals by fasting them. What did surprise Cobb, however, was that now, 1 year later, the father of the child Guylan spoke of was standing in his office and asking for his help. Cobb had revealed how he felt about Conklin's work in an earlier conversation with a colleague when he stated that fasting treatment was significant because it revealed the relationship between epilepsy and metabolism. In Cobb's mind, this relationship demanded to be explored. Cobb agreed to help. Howland scribbled out a check for enough to fund Cobb's efforts for 2 years. Cobb knew the difficulty of what he had just signed up for. He would have to tap the same dogged grit that allowed him to overcome his childhood stammer. To get to the bottom of Howland's question was to step into the unknown. Despite Gamble's intense effort, few solid leads had been found. All that was known for sure was fasting worked. Instinctually, he knew he would need help. First on Cobb's list to conscript into the effort was a Harvard-educated doctor named William Lennox. Enthusiastic, innovative, and bold, Lennox became interested in epilepsy after witnessing the unrelenting and mysterious convulsions of a friend's daughter while studying the health of missionary families in China in 1917. The strange nature of the disease stirred something in Lennox. In a stroke of serendipity, Lennox happened to be visiting Boston in the spring of 1921 and attended the AMA meeting where Guylan presented. Suddenly, Lennox found himself at a turning point. He commented that he was thrilled by Guylan's demonstration and having a compelling interest in epilepsy and its treatment. My missionary zeal was abruptly transferred from Chinese to epilepsy. The timing was perfect. Infused with Howland's cash, Cobb offered Lennox a position. It didn't take much convincing from Cobb to recruit Lennox. The intense curiosity simmering inside him made the decision easy. Together they launched into the problem. Howland's question was now expanded to include the ketogenic diet that had been defined a year earlier by Wilder. The diet was the preservation of the fasting state, and so by extension, the same rules probably applied. Whatever mechanism fasting worked through to mitigate seizures was most likely the same for the ketogenic diet. Wilder had added another suspect to the lineup, ketone bodies. Like Gamble, Cobb, and Lennox, he dove into the metabolic transformation that occurred within fasting epileptic patients with painstaking detail. And like Gamble, after some time had passed, they realized the answer was not going to present itself easily. Strangely, it seemed every path they followed ended with a contradiction, as if they were purposefully being toyed with. For example, Guylan had noticed his fasting patients excreted acid. The more acid excreted, the fewer seizures. Ketones are acidic, so maybe, they reasoned, it was the increase in acidosis within the patient's blood plasma from ketosis that was somehow acting to slow seizures. Other clues led them in this direction. Acidifying the patient's plasma by injecting acid directly into their veins seemed to have an anti-seizure effect. But the problem was in the timing. The anti-seizure effect didn't exactly track the acidification. Once the pH level was made acidic, it took a while for the seizures to slow. Similarly, when the blood pH level was returned to normal, it took some time for the seizures to return. This didn't match with the fact of the induction of ketosis, either by fasting or the ketogenic diet, typically resulted in an immediate reduction in seizures. So clearly it wasn't the acidity alone that mattered. Also, when they acidified the patient's blood, their seizures eventually slowed, but then after a period of time, even while the blood was kept acidic, the seizures would roar back with vicious ferocity, as if a dam had been burst. Maybe, as Wilder suggested, it was the ketone bodies themselves. To test this idea, Lennox and Cobb put a patient on the ketogenic diet. Once her seizures stopped, she was injected with bicarbonate, a compound that counteracts acid. When they tested her blood after the injection of bicarbonate, surprisingly, There was an increase in ketone bodies, but even with the increased ketones, her seizures returned with a vengeance. So clearly it wasn't the ketone bodies by themselves. Every time they tried to isolate the relevant variable, it would slip just out of reach. The nature of the problem was not lost on Cobb and Lennox. They recognized what it was: an incredibly complex and interrelated series of neurochemical alterations. The search, they realized, was probably just getting started. The painstaking accumulation of apparently unrelated facts must go on, wrote Lennox, until, like stones for a mosaic, they are sufficient in number to permit their assembly into a complete and intelligible design. The answer remained a map of the world before Columbus. The yet-to-be-explored forbade a complete image, and the existing technology was too rudimentary for the time being to fill in the gaps. It appeared that Howland's question, like the mapping of the Earth, might be a multi-generational effort. Chapter 5. Them Liar Hills. Even if Cobb and Lennox failed to find a clear, succinct answer to Howland's question, something special was happening in Boston. In 1930, Cobb, now 44 years old, was appointed director of the newly formed neurological unit at Boston City Hospital. Under his directorship, a powerhouse team of researchers, all united by an intense interest in epilepsy, fortuitously fell into place. Lennox followed Cobb to Boston City Hospital, and they were soon joined by a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon named Tracy Putnam and a Johns Hopkins-trained neurologist, Houston Merritt. Putnam and Merritt met while in the throes of a neurological internship at the hospital, and they experienced a powerful connection, forming a deep and enduring friendship. Both were described as brilliant and capable of having unusual insights. Putnam had more than a professional interest in epilepsy because two of his relatives, one a cousin whom he regarded as a sister, suffered from the affliction. Their talent, passion, and intellect did not go unnoticed by Cobb. He actively recruited them into the research effort. Together, the group formed a tempest of creativity. What happened at Boston City Hospital was a rare alignment of the stars, a group of personalities that collectively elevated their work far beyond any single individual's ability. An uninhibited atmosphere of infectious enthusiasm encouraged bold ideas. A writer described the unit. Its roster establishes the unit among the greatest institutions ever of its kind. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The fragile realization of the extraordinary research team was almost shattered in its infancy. When the Great Depression struck in 1930, it crushed research programs across the country. For Cobb and Lennox, when Howland's cash ran out, Harvard rushed to form an epilepsy commission, so their work wouldn't die on the vine. The program was funded by voluntary donations, which shut off like a spigot in the aftermath of Black Tuesday. At the last second, the Rockefeller Institute stepped in. If they hadn't, the history of epilepsy treatment may have had its course altered in incalculable ways. The group knew the largest obstacle to understanding and improving treatments was a lack of good animal models to study. The current models used chemicals to induce seizures, a clumsy and inconsistent method that gave sometimes wildly different results. The newly developed electroencephalographic instrument, EEG, was able to record electrical discharge from patients' brains. When strapped to an epileptic patient's head, through a frantic amplification of squiggles on paper, the machine revealed a tornado of excessive electrical discharge. No one knew why the storm occurred, where it came from, or what caused it to disappear. But the new machine identified what a seizure was: electrical impulses firing without purpose, an overload of signal pulsating through the brain. Putnam reasoned that if a seizure was an electrical discharge, then maybe he could trigger a seizure in animals by the same route, by administering an electric shock. The group seized Putnam's insight. Using parts from an electric motor taken from a salvaged World War I German airplane, they assembled a makeshift machine that would meter out a trigger, a measured electric shock. After some deliberation, Putnam and Merritt decided to test their new machine on cats. The idea was simple: test the cats to see how much a pulse caused them to have a seizure. Then, give the same cats the drug to be tested, Wait 2 hours, and repeat the test. If the cats required more of a shock to trigger a seizure while on the drug, then it was logical to assume the drug was anticonvulsive. Testing known drugs confirmed their logic. When the cats were given bromide, it took 50% more current to generate a seizure than before. When given phenobarbital, it took 3 to 4 times more current than before. Their model was consistent and reproducible. The group then made a vital observation. Ever since the discovery of bromides, it had always been assumed it was the hypnotic or sedative effect of drugs that muted convulsions. The two properties were inseparable. The new experimental system allowed them to test that assumption. When Putnam and Merritt drugged the cats with bromide and phenobarbital to the exact same sedative state, to the point that prevented the cats from walking, and then used their apparatus to test the seizure threshold, phenobarbital was still much better. This teased out a critical detail. It implied that the sedative property and the anticonvulsive property were not chained together, they could be separated. They now realized it wasn't necessarily the sedative property of the drugs that made them work. This discovery unshackled the search for new anti-seizure drugs. Effectively, it removed a massive barrier that had inhibited anti-seizure drug development for about 70 years. The narrow canyon researchers were searching in was suddenly expanded into an open field. Putnam and Merritt realized the opportunity and began to use their animal model to test new drugs. As modest as it seems on the surface, the experimental system was revolutionary. This was one of the first scaled-up uses of animals to test drugs that might prove useful in humans, a process now called translational medicine. Given that phenobarbital was the best drug available, Putnam made a short leap of logic. He would test derivatives of phenobarbital compounds that were chemically similar. Their animal model and method of screening compounds was Henry Ford's newly developed assembly line recapitulated into the industry of drug discovery. A quantum leap in productivity. Before, the process of drug discovery was mostly accidental, now it was purposeful. The system vastly streamlined the probability for successfully finding new drugs because it allowed for screening en masse. They would be able to churn through chemicals with untold speed and precision. Putnam began to search. He combed through the Eastman Chemical Company catalog looking for compounds that were structurally just a shade away from phenobarbital. At the same time, he was calling pharmaceutical companies, asking if they had anything that resembled phenobarbital, specifically. Because they had shown the hypnotic quality of anti-seizure drugs was not essential, he requested compounds that were thought to be hypnotic but had not proven to be. Only one returned Putnam's call, Arthur Docks, a chemist at Park Davis. At the end of April, a package arrived at Boston City Hospital from Docks with Putnam's name on it. Inside were 7 analogs of phenobarbital and a dozen other compounds that fit Putnam's description. Docks warned Putnam of the futility of what he was trying to accomplish. He told him his search was a waste of time because the compounds had already been thoroughly tested and were inactive. But Docks had only tested the compounds for the sedative effect, assuming, like everyone, that was enough to rule them out as anticonvulsive drugs. He was unaware that the Boston group had reason to believe otherwise. One of the phenobarbital derivatives, called phenytoin, had been sitting on the shelf at Park Davis for decades. The company had purchased the compound from a German organic chemist in 1908, hoping it had sedative properties. But when the compound was found to be only mildly sedative, it was placed on the shelf in a storeroom and forgotten. The overlooked compound was first on the list for Putnam and Merritt to test. They knew it had failed as a sleeping pill and so had less of a sedative effect than current drugs. When they gave the drug to the cats, it was clear they weren't overly impaired. Docks was right. It was only mildly sedative. But when they tested the cat's seizure threshold, it left them in astonishment. The drug raised the threshold far beyond the other known drugs, without heavily sedating them. This was exactly what they were looking for, the holy grail of epilepsy treatment, a drug that was less sedative yet powerfully anticonvulsive. The early 1930s were a much different time. Regulators didn't require preclinical safety testing for new drugs. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was signed in 1938. Nevertheless, just to be sure, Putnam and Merritt handed the drug over to a toxicologist at Harvard and one at Parke-Davis. Both found phenytoin could be given to cats, dogs, and rats at very high single and repeated doses without immediate toxic effects. This was enough to clear the path, and they started treating patients in May. By the summer of 1938, they had treated 200 adult and pediatric patients with phenytoin, now branded Dilantin, and presented their results at an AMA meeting in San Francisco. The results were remarkable. According to Putnam and Merritt, Dilantin was able to eliminate or greatly reduce the seizures in 85% of the patients tested. Minor toxic symptoms were reported in 15% of the patients, and more serious toxic reactions were reported in 5%. 6 days later, Parke-Davis added Dilantin to its list of marketed products. The rest is history. The popularity of the drug grew quickly. By 1940, it was hailed as ushering in a new epoch in the treatment of epilepsy. One doctor called it the most remarkable and important chemotherapeutic agent in the convulsive disorders since 1912. Truly, a new era had taken hold for epileptic patients. Across the country, doctors began prescribing Dilantin as a first-line treatment for their patients. The discovery of Dilantin did something else. It aroused and unbridled the capitalistic instinct of pharmaceutical companies. They paid close attention to the discovery of Dilantin. Perhaps even more important than the discovery of Dilantin itself was the permanent enshrinement of the methodology established by Putnam and Merritt. The significance of Putnam and Merritt's animal model was not lost on Big Pharma. The companies quickly established their own in-house large-scale drug screening programs. Putnam and Merritt themselves screened over 700 compounds for anticonvulsive activity between 1937 and 1945. The massively scaled-up efforts did produce results. Over the next 2 decades, a dozen new anticonvulsants hit the shelves at the pharmacy. As quickly as the new era of anticonvulsive drugs was ushered in, the ketogenic diet was ushered out. Dilantin was viewed as modern medicine at its best. It was a symbol of progress, of mankind's continuous vector of medical advancement. With the advent of seizure control for many patients in the form of a pill, the onerous diet was soon regarded as rigid and expensive, and began a sharp descent from favor. A pill was so much easier. A pill took a doctor seconds to scribble its prescription. The diet took time and effort of many individuals: the doctor, a dietitian, nurses, and the families. With a pill, everyone was released. They no longer had to plan every shopping list and meal. The kids and families could live normal lives. They no longer were cast as outsiders. They could enjoy the same food everybody else was having. They could now have birthday cake, pancakes with syrup, and dessert alongside their friends and family. They didn't have to watch from the sidelines. History is full of research that drifts off like an unfinished conversation. Alongside the ketogenic diet, Howland's original question faded from relevance. It was a strange query from a bygone era. How fasting, or the ketogenic diet, worked to stop seizures no longer mattered to the vast majority of researchers. But not everyone felt that way. It faded from view with a smattering of unheard protest. At the Mayo Clinic, Peterman found Dilantin disappointing compared to the ketogenic diet. Ironically, years later, speaking to a group of resident physicians at the NIH, National Institute of Health, Washington, D.C., Dr. Merritt was rumored to tell the young doctors that his discovery of phenytoin was a major setback to the understanding of epilepsy. He felt the line of research started by Howland's original question of why fasting worked, and then morphing to the ketogenic diet, was a thread that could have ultimately led to a deeper understanding into the mechanisms of epilepsy. In 1960, almost 40 years after he was recruited to work on Howland's question, Lennox looked back nostalgically. Though interest in fasting, or the ketogenic diet, as a treatment has almost vanished, doubtless much scientific gold remains in them Thar hills. By 1990, the ketogenic diet was all but completely forgotten. It was a strange, antiquated side note that most physicians felt belonged in a history book, not a modern textbook. The diet was labeled rigid, unpalatable, and constraining on daily life. Johns Hopkins, one of the original hospitals to help develop and utilize the diet in the 20s and 30s, barely managed to preserve a single prescribing physician. Dr. John Freeman and his dietitian Millicent Kelly, a 72-year-old that had been administering the diet for 40 years. There was vanishingly little demand for their services. Kelly taught the ketogenic diet to the families of less than 10 children a year. To the doctors around the country, Freeman and Kelly might as well have been a museum exhibit. Kelly scribbled in an old notepad, calculating ratios and jotting down recipes for the families. Together, we were the keepers of the flame, Freeman later wrote. Besides Kelly, so few dietitians were trained in the nuances of the diet that when it was used, it was administered sloppily, and the children often had bad outcomes. The lessons of the past, that it took precise calculations to achieve the best seizure control, were all but lost. The bad results were folded into the perception that the diet was old, outdated, and not as effective as the current drugs. The widespread opinion was that the diet did not work and was difficult to tolerate, and its use was no longer justified. Across the country, its use became almost non-existent. Chapter 6. Wait a minute, this didn't have to happen. As the Abrahamses flew to Baltimore for the last remaining chance to treat Charlie's unremitting seizures, their thoughts cartwheeled between sadness, desperation, and the last sliver of hope. Most likely they were experiencing the same emotions as the Howlands as they rode the train toward Battle Creek 80 years earlier. As he traversed the American landscape, Abrahams was entirely unaware of the rich history surrounding the ketogenic diet as a treatment for epilepsy. That it was once the standard of care for epilepsy would have shocked and bewildered him even more so. For Abrahams and most doctors and patients across the country, the ketogenic diet was dead, reduced to the equivalent of an herbalist working out of a strip mall. When they arrived at Johns Hopkins, they met with Dr. Freeman and his dietitian, Millicent Kelly. The pair seemed perfectly matched. Dr. Freeman was the maverick. He was larger than life, fearless. He knew he was considered an outlier by a lot of his colleagues, but in a way I think that intrigued him. Millicent was the soft side, comforting, grandmother-like mannerisms that were amplified to almost cartoonish levels. With a charming and soothing voice that seemed to round the edges of every word, she explained the diet to Abrahams. With no time to spare, they began the diet with a jump start. They fasted Charlie the rest of the day and into the next. By the next day, when Abrahams held his son, he could already tell a difference. He just felt less intense, like something had been turned down. By the next day, 48 hours later, something remarkable happened. His son stopped having seizures. Completely. The Abrahamses returned home brimming with optimism and hope. Days passed, and then weeks, and the seizures remained at bay. The diet had an incredibly powerful impact. It had done what all those drugs and surgery were unable to do. It had brought his son back from the abyss. Charlie began to thrive. His mental capacity and energy returned. The house, once filled with tears, was now filled with joy. The story of the Abrahamses would have ended there. They would have been just one of the 10 families or so that Dr. Freeman and Millicent quietly helped every year. But like Howland before him, the experience aroused something deep. Medicine had failed them. Things began to stir in Abrahams when he returned to his normal life. Something just didn't sit well. All of a sudden my eyes opened up in the middle of the night, and I said, "Wait a minute. This didn't have to happen." 90% of these seizures didn't have to occur. Waking up around the clock and pouring drugs down his throat, that did not have to occur. Abraham's epiphany morphed into puzzlement and anger. What motivated him the most is that he was in a position to prevent this from happening to others. Where Howland had the money of a wealthy corporate lawyer, Abrahams had something even better. Perhaps the best resource in the world for taking up a cause. He had Hollywood. Abrahams had produced blockbuster hits like Airplane, Naked Gun, and Hot Shots. If it was simply a lack of information, he could change that. So he and his wife Nancy started the now famous Charlie Foundation, dedicated to disseminating information about the ketogenic diet, so Charlie's story would not be repeated. On October 26, 1994, the NBC News program Dateline brought Charlie's story into millions of living rooms across the country. At the end of the show, viewers were given a number to call. Families that called were sent a video from the Charlie Foundation, titled An Introduction to the Ketogenic Diet. The foundation also mailed the same tape to neurologists throughout the country. Shortly after, neurologists were mailed another video, titled The Ketogenic Diet, Doctor's Version. It was a well-orchestrated plan and its impact was enormous. Abrahams also had the Charlie Foundation ready to fund a 7-center trial designed to measure the impact of the ketogenic diet once and for all. A trial would serve to demonstrate the efficacy of the forgotten diet for both patients and doctors. It was timed perfectly. Shortly before the Dateline special, the Charlie Foundation quietly had doctors, dietitians, nurses, and families with an epileptic child come to Johns Hopkins and receive intensive training on the use of the proven Johns Hopkins ketogenic diet protocol. The doctors and their staffs were then ready and waiting for the anticipated surge of new patients coming from this media blitz that began with the primetime Dateline special. As expected, the kids came from all corners of the country, desperate to try the new diet. 4 years later, Freeman published the results from 150 kids that entered the trial. The patient group enrolled in the trial was a tough lot. As a group, they averaged 410 seizures per month and had already failed to improve after trying an average of 6.2 medications. Nevertheless, the outcome was dramatic. Of the 55% still on the diet after a year, 27% were close to seizure-free, 23% were significantly improved, and the remaining 5% had a less than 50% reduction of seizures. 3 to 6 years later, 27% of these same children had few to no seizures and most were off of the diet and on fewer to no medication. To further raise public awareness, a year before the data from the trial was published, Abrahams released an ABC television movie titled First Do No Harm, starring his good friend Meryl Streep. It was the dramatic portrayal of a Midwestern family's struggle to find the ketogenic diet for their child with severe and unresponsive epilepsy. 8 million viewers watched the movie the night it was aired. In truth, the Charlie Foundation's clinical trial just confirmed the results of the 13 other studies that had been performed since Wilder first purposed the diet as a treatment in 1921. The only difference this time, because of Jim Abrahams' elegantly choreographed media campaign, was that people were actually paying attention. The study was presented at the annual American Epilepsy Society in 1996. Before the study was presented, the ketogenic diet was almost never mentioned at the annual gathering. But this time, combined with the media firestorm, it precipitated an avalanche of research the following year, and only grew in the years after that. The ketogenic diet had been resurrected, as quickly as it had fallen, because of the discovery of Dilantin. Now, it had been revived by a passionate family and their sick child. 7 minutes and 55 seconds into the Dateline special featuring Charlie's story, Charlie's doctor, Donald Shields, said something important. The reporter asked Dr. Shields, "You had some knowledge this diet was probably working back at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Shields and Dr. Freeman were actually good friends. Yet you dissuaded the Abrahams from attempting it. How come?" Dr. Shields paused, looked at the ceiling, and said, "Well, because I don't think we had exhausted all of the medical approaches yet. There were actually other medications we hadn't tried yet." Drawing a distinction between so-called medical approaches and the ketogenic diet reveals volumes of the way many doctors view the dietary protocol. Something existing outside of the realm of real medicine. Something strange, non-conventional, and alternative. Why else would the diet have faded into complete obscurity in the first place? Even today, the diet is rarely used as a first-line treatment. It is still something held in reserve. Epilepsy is almost always treated first with drugs. Medication will make half of the patient seizure-free for an extended period of time. But if a patient doesn't respond to the first drug, the odds rapidly diminish. In these cases, a second drug will only make an additional 14% seizure-free. If that drug fails, then the likelihood of seizure control using drugs falls to about 1 to 2%. Remarkably, even with the most recent anti-seizure drugs, these ratios have remained essentially the same throughout the century, as if some fundamental barrier cannot be breached by drugs alone. So that leaves more than 30% of epileptic patients without seizure control, even with the latest and best medications. Before Abrahams pulled the diet from obscurity, these patients had nowhere to turn. Today, this is where the ketogenic diet is typically used, as an option of last resort. For the over 30% of patients with uncontrolled seizures after failing drug therapy, the ketogenic diet is a godsend. If maintained properly, it renders half of this desperate group either completely or extremely close to seizure-free. These incredible results have been shown consistently in study after study throughout the 20th century. In addition, most kids who use the diet can transition back to a normal Western diet after 2 years, never needing drugs again, and remain seizure-free. After combing through the statistics, an inevitable question arises: why is the diet only held as an option of last resort? One can't help but wonder, which is better as a first-line treatment, drugs or the ketogenic diet? To be sure, the comparisons, from trials alone, are not apples to apples. A direct head-to-head comparison has never been done. The answer to this question remains unknown. However, there is a very important difference between the studies of anti-seizure drugs and the ketogenic diet. All of the modern studies of the ketogenic diet use a patient population that has failed drug treatment. The dietary trials have a built-in bias from the starting line. The tests done on the ketogenic diet are enrolled with the hardest cases, patients with gritty, embedded seizures that refuse to be blunted by the best medications available. You've already peeled off the easiest cases. It's like running a 100-yard dash with a weight chained to your leg, said Dr. James Wheelis, a pediatric neurologist and a recognized expert on the use of the ketogenic diet. Even in the face of such difficult odds, the ketogenic diet shows incredible results. Of course, any comparison of a special diet versus drugs must also include side effects. Even modern drugs aren't completely benign. When Charlie was saturated in anti-seizure drugs, Abrahams described him as a zombie who lived in his car seat. Although technology has continued to separate the sedative effect and the anti-seizure effect, it is not perfect. Drugs often leave patients lethargic, dizzy, and with double vision. Rashes appear, weight gain, abnormal liver function, kidney stones, and constipation. The biggest difference between anti-seizure medication and the ketogenic diet occurs in the brain. Indeed, the brain is ground zero in the debate of diet versus drugs. The side effects that occur from medication are not there in the diet. In fact, the opposite occurs. Doctors today notice the same mental effects as the original pioneers of the diet back at the beginning of the 20th century: increased alertness, improved behavior, reduced anxiety and depression. How the patient experiences life is markedly different between drugs and the diet, a variable that defies quantification. The strict form of the diet is not without some issues. Side effects do occur, but they are very minor, including changes in lipid profiles, kidney stones, constipation, and a subtle slowing of growth. However, improvements in the diet formulation, macronutrient sources, supplements, and interventions have greatly diminished lipid abnormalities, constipation, and kidney stones. A 2010 study at Johns Hopkins followed the outcomes of children treated with the ketogenic diet from 1993 to 2008 and found almost no long-term adverse effects. The only obvious effect was growth. Height was found to be reduced by 5 centimeters from the expected average. All other laboratory values were normal. Most importantly, the study found the subjects had continued to either maintain or improve on seizure control, even into adulthood. Most of the families had few regrets and would recommend the diet to others. All added up, results combined with side effects. Many experts in the field give a nod to the ketogenic diet when directly compared to drugs. They feel the diet is often simply the best medical option. No anticonvulsive drugs have that rate of beneficial effect, wrote Dr. Freeman. Despite the heroic efforts of Abrahams, his wife Nancy, and the Charlie Foundation, the ketogenic diet is today still underutilized. When an epileptic child enters a neurologist's practice, the typical scenario goes like this. The patient is prescribed a first-line drug. As stated above, this works about half of the time. For the half that fail to respond, the neurologist will prescribe another drug. This time the drug works in about 1 in 7 kids. It doesn't matter which drug is chosen, the statistics remain the same. For the kids that don't respond to the second drug, the neurologist will now almost always try a third. The chance the third drug will work now falls to 1%. This leaves over 1 in 3 kids that come back to the neurologist office in a desperate situation after having failed 3 drugs. The neurologist now has a decision to make. According to a 2008 special report issued by a consortium of 26 world-recognized experts using the ketogenic diet from 9 countries, this is precisely where the diet should be prescribed after the failure of 2 to 3 drugs. At this point, the data begs to be heard. The ketogenic diet will make over half of this desperate group of kids either entirely or very close to seizure-free. The other half simply can't or won't maintain the diet for a variety of reasons. Either they find the diet isn't working, or it's too hard to maintain. Prescribing a 4th drug has a vanishingly small chance of working. Yet, strangely, in many cases, the neurologist will keep going, writing script after script for more and more drugs. Many doctors never suggesting the diet, the same dreadful place Charlie and his family found themselves. When I asked Jim Abrahams if Charlie's story still happens today, he responded in a sober tone, sadly, yes. And in many ways it's worse. The reason is because there are more drugs. The physicians frequently say, well, there is another drug, let's try that instead. From what we see, from those who contact us, I don't know the exact statistics, but rarely is the diet prescribed after the failure of 2 or 3 medications. Why the diet continues to be marginalized is a poignant question. It's a culture shift, said Dr. Wheelis. The mindset today is to take a pill and be done. If the diet was in pill form, it would be the best treatment available. It raises an important question. Are we as a culture, both patients and physicians, willing to marginalize an incredibly effective therapy at the expense of some convenience? The question is especially relevant considering the price paid is so incredibly high. One of the things that pisses me off the most is that the whole degree of difficulty thing is just stupid. It's not a medical question, said Abrahams. When you're holding your kid while he has hundreds of seizures a day, and then you find out doctors aren't giving you all the information because they think it's too difficult. Where in medical school did they teach a course on what's considered too difficult for the parents of a critically ill child? To get this right is not trivial. Epilepsy affects 65 million people across the globe, almost 1% of the world's population. The most updated statistic released by the CDC claim 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their life. Despite extensive testing, over half of all cases are idiopathic, meaning no reason for the illness can be found. It mostly affects children, but can also affect adults, the chances increasing with age. It is a terrifying disease because there are so many unknowns. Still today, after centuries of investigation, researchers cannot tell you exactly what a seizure is, where it comes from, or why it stops. Words crop up like multifactorial and network effect, which, although true, are really a way of saying, we don't know exactly. A bucket to throw very difficult problems in. Epilepsy erodes at the edges of life, interrupting, stealing, and isolating its victims. It is not passive. Over time, if severe enough, epilepsy won't allow the brain to develop correctly. It is a tremendous burden for societies across the globe. And to let an extraordinary therapy remain underprescribed because of an undefined apathy, this is tragic and deserves an explanation. Near the end of the Dateline special featuring Charlie's story, the reporter asked Dr. Shields a final question. Dr. Freeman tells us that 50 to 70% of the patients that come through his doors and get put on the ketogenic diet have success. Can you think of any drugs, in these hard cases, that have 50 to 70% success rates? Dr. Shields again looked to the ceiling before answering. Probably not anything that comes up to that level. After some reflection, Dr. Shields backpedaled and came up with a possible explanation for this astonishing situation. A reason why the diet is so often ignored. There is no big drug company behind the ketogenic diet, and there will never be unless somebody starts marketing sausage and eggs with cream sauce on it as a drug. Abrahams agrees with Dr. Shields' assessment about why the diet remains in the shadows. It's not in the form of a pill, it can't be administered with a scalpel, and the only people who profit from the ketogenic diet are the patients, said Abrahams. At the front line of the Charlie Foundation's efforts is their head nutritionist Beth Zupic-Kania. Over her 24 years with the Charlie Foundation, Beth has trained dietitians in 10 countries and treated thousands of epileptic patients around the world. Perhaps more than anyone, she has witnessed the power of the ketogenic diet to treat epilepsy firsthand. Typically, when she sees a patient, they are on at least 2 anti-seizure drugs, have failed many more, are sick, frustrated, and exhausted. The patients that finally turn to the diet do so for more than one reason, said Zupic-Kania. Their seizures continue unabated, or they are experiencing such severe side effects that they are essentially non-functional, or both. Sadly, it's usually both. Most are left simmering in a state of pronounced lethargy because of the drugs. Some drugs are worse than others. The worst drug is Topamax, said Zupic-Kania. The nickname that the doctors call it behind the backs of patients is Dope A Max, because it makes you feel so dopey. The patients can't think of words that they used to know. With the diet, she says that parents often notice a marked mental improvement once the child achieves ketosis. And this improvement occurs while the patients are on the same amount of drugs. Neurologists typically won't start reducing the drugs until the patient has maintained the diet for at least a month, after it's clear they are tolerating it well. The difference is striking. All of a sudden the kid is paying attention, or stringing words together, kind of coming out of a fog, said Zupic-Kania. Jim has a video of this mom describing her 6-year-old son. He got up, he went to the bathroom, he cleaned up, and he came back to bed, and he hadn't done that in the past year. The moment he went into ketosis, he got his life back. Zupic-Kania said the short-term side effects from the diet are preventable, and researchers have yet to find any long-term side effects. In fact, she has a different take. I think these patients are healthier because of what they are not eating. Having worked with thousands of people, many of them will continue leaving processed foods and sugar out of their diets and are healthier in the long run, she says. Through her quarter-century of experience, she has also made another striking observation. The ridged boundaries of the diet, the 4-to-1 ratio that has been the gold standard for patients, may not be as vital to achieving seizure control as once thought. Lots of patients probably don't need the full-blown ketogenic diet to get better. We could probably use something far more liberal and have the same effect. And I'm not even talking about the modified Atkins diet, which is used mainly for adolescents and adults with epilepsy. I'm talking about a paleo-type diet. I spoke to a mom last night who said her son just started having seizures out of the blue, and after her nutritionist eliminated wheat and sugar from his diet, his seizures stopped immediately. I would love to spare some people of the difficulty of the rigid form of the diet if it's not needed. And now we're finding that just a low glycemic index diet can really work in some cases. There is a whole spectrum of people and a whole spectrum of diets to meet their needs. Dr. Jung Rowe, of the University of Calgary, is on the forefront of the current effort to answer Howland's original question. For Dr. Rowe, the question remains as haunting today as it did in 1921. Rowe is nearing the end of a $2 million, 5-year grant from the NIH to find the mechanism behind the ketogenic diet's action on epilepsy. And as with those that came before him, Cobb, Lennox, Gamble, and Dr. Howland, the answer, wrote Rowe, remains elusive. Rowe's estimation of the diet's effect is essentially the same as Lennox's stones, forming a mosaic description almost a century ago. At present, there are many hypotheses regarding the ketogenic diet's action. And while each is uniquely compelling, it is becoming more apparent that the ketogenic diet likely works through multiple mechanisms, Dr. Rowe said. It's not surprising Dr. Rowe and others have yet to pin down the diet's exact mechanism of action. Given the nature of the human brain, an organ with 125 trillion neural synapses just in the cerebral cortex alone, a number roughly equal to the number of stars in 1,500 Milky Way galaxies. That level of staggering complexity, combined with the fact that the pathophysiological mechanism behind seizures is still largely unknown, appears to have rendered Howland's question still out of our technological reach. Perhaps the most important realization from Dr. Rowe's research is a deeper understanding of the nature of epilepsy. The scientific literature involving the ketogenic diet strongly supports the notion that epilepsy may indeed in part represent a metabolic disease, and that this concept could serve as a novel framework for the development of more effective anti-seizure drugs, Rowe wrote in July of 2015. Chapter 7. The Genie is Out of the Bottle. Even though, within the largely incentive-driven arena of medicine, the ketogenic diet is still clearly underprescribed today as a therapy for epilepsy, Jim Abrahams single-handedly managed to thrust the forgotten therapy back into the public and scientific consciousness. Before his Hollywood-fueled campaign, the diet lay dormant, an artifact. After his media intervention, researchers were once again stirred by the curious power of the ketogenic diet. Jim unknowingly resurrected a query from a bygone era. To any curious biochemist, it is still astonishing in its own right that a simple shift in macromolecular consumption could have such a profound effect on brain chemistry. By the late 1990s, researchers turned their attention and laboratory space over to the ketogenic diet with revolutionary zeal. The number of researcher papers containing the phrase ketogenic diet exploded from only 225 before the year 2000 to 1,400 in the 15 years after the year 2000. The earlier articles published were almost exclusively about the role of the diet in epilepsy, but around the turn of the century, researchers had begun to nudge at the margins of the diet, exploring its possible role beyond epilepsy. Researchers, for the first time, began asking other questions of the diet. Could it be used to treat or prevent other diseases? First, it was cancer in 1995. It was a tiny study, only 2 little girls with brain cancer, but the results hinted at a potent impact and precipitated an avalanche of research into ketosis and cancer. As biochemists uncovered the unique mechanistic details of ketosis, it opened new possibilities. One paper, in 2003, by NIH scientists Richard Veitch and George Cahill, was a siren call. Specifically, it suggested the ketogenic diet, or ketone bodies by themselves, had the potential to affect a wide swath of pathologic conditions precipitated by insulin resistance and dysfunctional mitochondrial metabolism, fundamental processes that can lead to a constellation of problems. What are the potential uses of beta-hydroxybutyrate in addition to pediatric epilepsy? Asked Dr. Veitch. Theoretically, any condition where an oxygen supply to cells may be limited is an avenue for investigation. The list would encompass almost every disease state. The paper was a foot in the door, behind which was an open-ended spectrum of possibility. Other researchers took notice. Studies on physical performance, Alzheimer's, and depression began in 2004. Parkinson's disease, traumatic brain injury, type 2 diabetes, Lafora body disease, polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, and metabolic syndrome in 2005, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, in 2006, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in 2007. Incredibly, perhaps counterintuitively, the ketogenic diet showed promise to modify the course of one disease after the next. The strangely vast spectrum of diseases the diet appeared to attenuate caught many researchers off guard. Clearly, the diet was able to shift metabolism and genetic expression at some base level that prevented, rejuvenated, and protected cells, tissues, and organs, notably the brain, from the accumulation of disease-causing damage. Like epilepsy, in most cases the exact influence ketones were having on the variety of diseases remained elusive. Howland's question became vastly expanded. The Charlie Foundation became a conduit for the ketogenic diet's sudden expansion and interest. The calls, once dominated by the pleas of epileptic patients, made an abrupt shift to other diseases. Now, around the turn of the century, when the phone rang or an email came in, it was most likely a cancer patient, or someone with Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, or other more obscure problems. The foundation decided to evolve and allowed itself to be led by the science. They changed their name from the Charlie Foundation for Pediatric Epilepsy to the Charlie Foundation for Ketogenic Therapies. Suddenly, Zupik Kania found herself teaching the diet to a vastly expanded group of health professionals. "We get more calls from cancer patients than epileptics now," she said. Zupik Kania has noticed the utility of the diet continues to heave and undulate, covering additional ailments. Its circle of effectiveness, surprisingly, continues to expand. "I'm getting more and more calls from people with migraines, which 16% of Americans suffer from. We've found out the diet is super effective for migraines. And surprisingly, the other one is hot flashes from menopause. The ketogenic diet, even a liberal ketogenic diet, cures hot flashes." For most of history, epilepsy was viewed as a supernatural possession. Even today, vestiges of a mystical dimension linger. We know the disease is biological in origin, but it remains an enigma. It transcends our ability to succinctly explain it. That a subtle shift in energy metabolism is able to exorcise epileptic fits evokes imagery of preternatural healing, a biological force beyond our understanding. Incredibly, the discovery that the beneficial transition to ketone metabolism extends far past epilepsy, into unimaginable arenas of disease, only carries this image further. As evocative as it is astonishing. The literature reflects this feeling. Words like magical, superfuel, jet fuel, and magic bullet slip from the pens of typically skeptical, objective, and clinical scientists. The turn of the century marked the transition. The doors now open to a new era of medicine that, refreshingly, might have more to do with prevention than the never-ending cat-and-mouse game of diagnosing and treating disease after they have become intractably embedded. A game that is almost by definition impossible to win. But it even goes beyond prevention. Ketone research has seduced us into imagining that it might be possible to lift ourselves onto even higher planes of health and vitality. A bold new era of medicine beckons. Never have we asked if our health can be elevated, optimized, and extended with such vast technological resources at our fingertips. The hybrid nature of human metabolism to utilize ketones as an energy source was not fully appreciated until the 1960s. And even then it was typically confused with diabetic ketoacidosis, a pathological condition that has nothing to do with fasting or nutritional ketosis in general. Nevertheless, the two were lumped together and the true disease-modifying potential of nutritional ketosis was not fully appreciated until around the turn of the century. We now know, the shift to ketone metabolism goes far beyond the swapping of one fuel for another. Hidden just below the surface, we've uncovered a new layer of complexity. We now know ketones are absolutely profound in their impact to human physiology. Critically, they act as signaling molecules and carry deeply conserved messages to our DNA, messages that vastly impact our overall health. Ketones change the architecture of our DNA, rearranging the way it is expressed, turning on the same rejuvenating pathways stimulated by caloric restriction or periodic fasting. Ketones appear to powerfully reduce inflammatory pathways, the smoldering process that is blamed for a vast spectrum of problems, even a reduction of overall lifespan. There is a growing consensus that most of the so-called modern diseases of civilization, obesity, type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's, cancer and many others, all ripple outward from a central core of metabolic dysfunction. These modern diseases, once considered pathologically distinct, converge to the same central place, a place that ketone metabolism concentrates its profoundly rejuvenating and repairing capacity. As Dr. Veach has said, ketosis is a normal physiological state. I would argue it is the normal state of man. It's not normal to have a McDonald's and a delicatessen on every corner. It's normal to starve. Perhaps many of our modern ailments are a result of stepping too far from our natural state of existence. It's easy to recognize the societal resistance to any rigid dietary adjustment, and the research is underway to find shortcuts. The 20th century was about understanding the ketogenic diet, said Dr. Wheelis. The 21st century is going to be about trying to capture its incredible benefits in a pill. Science is a building that is constantly under construction. The progress we are making today rises from a foundation built by others. In addition to all those mentioned in the article, the work of Drs. Richard Veach, Sami Hashim and Henri Brunengräber has laid the concrete that we in this field all work and build on. These metabolic gurus were responsible for opening the blinds and illuminating the therapeutic potential of exogenous ketone supplementation. Standing on the shoulders of these giants, our laboratory at University of South Florida has been studying the effects of ketone supplementation on numerous disease states, physical performance and resilience against extreme environments. Could these small molecules, once thought to be metabolic waste, hold the potential to treat and prevent a constellation of metabolic-related illnesses? Do they capture the time-honored benefits of caloric restriction or intermittent fasting? Can they enhance our health, vitality, and longevity, allowing the baby boomers, a generation that refuses to go gently into that good night, to extract more from life for longer? The initial results look promising. The data emerging rapidly from studies on nutritional ketosis are compelling and have far-reaching implications. Perhaps Jim Abrahams said it best: "The genie is out of the bottle." The end. This has been The Origin and Future of the Ketogenic Diet by Dr. Dominic D'Agostino and Travis Christofferson. Narrated by Johnny Rockermeier. Produced in 2023 by Johnny Rockermeier, all rights reserved. This book is a charity publication that supports the important cancer research of Dr. Thomas Seyfried. You can get more information about other books on this topic and our donations on our homepage at ketoforcancer.net.